Hello again. Now that the baseball season, the NBA, and the college basketball tournament have all been called off in these parlous times, this is your entertainment. Little gallows humor there. All right. Now, by now I trust you have all had time to listen to my introductory remarks on Arthur Miller and read the excerpts from his influential essay, Tragedy and the Common Man, which was published in 1949, the same year as Death of a Salesman. In many respects, Willy Loman is a prototype of the tragic common man that Miller describes. I'm going to devote this lecture to an analysis of the play's first act, okay? And the next lecture, which will be somewhat shorter, will analyze Act 2 and the closing requiem. Let's begin with Miller's extensive opening stage directions. It's Brooklyn, 1949, 4 years after the end of World War II, a time of change in the United States. The nation is rebuilding in these post-war years. New York neighborhoods are changing. A young generation of returning soldiers are re-entering the job market. Now, these social and economic changes leave the aging Willy Loman feeling isolated and displaced and confused. The changes and the threat that modernity poses are reflected in the play's setting, where we're told, "Before us is the salesman's house. We are aware of a towering angular set of shapes behind it, surrounding it on all sides. As more light appears on stage, we see a solid vault of apartment houses around the small, fragile-seeming home of Willy Loman." Willy's house is encircled by new apartment buildings, imposing but utterly impersonal. They go up quickly. Like his little home, Willy himself is fragile, both physically and we'll certainly see mentally. Now, as America then moves into the future, Willy is clinging increasingly to the past. Or, if he's not clinging to the past, on occasion, he's fantasizing a future that has no possible basis in reality. What we realize quite early in the play is that the one thing that Willy cannot bear is life in the present, which he complains about to his long-suffering and devoted wife, Linda. He says, in a typical moment about the current times, "The street is lined with cars, Linda. There's not a breath of fresh air in the neighborhood. The grass don't grow anymore. You can't raise a carrot in the backyard." Now, you'll note that at the beginning of the play and throughout, there is the sound of a flute that Miller reports. A melody is heard even before the lights open on the stage. It is played by a flute. It is small and fine, telling of grass and trees and the horizon. Now, you'll note then that this suggestion of the flute sound linked to grass and trees is linked to the things that Willy remembers from the past that are currently missing from his changing Brooklyn neighborhood. We tend to hear this flute sound recur in the play, especially when Willy is drifting into memories of those past days. Many of those memories are linked, of course, to his extravagant and impossible dreams for the future, which he sort of extrapolates from certain moments in the past. But the fact is that all of Willy's dreams ultimately trace back to Willy's father, who was himself a dreamer, a man who made wooden flutes, who sold them all over the country. But curiously, though he's certainly linked with the past in that regard and with Willy's dreams, this is a man who Willy himself never really knew because he seemed to have disappeared in Willy's very early childhood. Nevertheless, the flute is the sound then, both of Willy's memories of certain moments in the past and also of Willy's impossible aspirations for the future, which trace back to his thoughts about his father. Now, Death of a Salesman is a distinctively American tragedy, one that is rooted, as we'll see, in the failure of two American myths that Willy Loman cherishes, that he has inherited as an American, but which he is unable to live up to in the way that his father did. The first of these two myths is the so-called bootstrap myth. That is, the story of the little man of humble origins who becomes a great success by grit and determination. It's the Horatio Alger narrative, especially in that it is really the national myth of America. It is essentially the definition of the American dream, this rising from humble origins through one's own efforts to economic success. The second national myth that Willie inherits, but also fails to live up to, is the myth of the American West, the myth of the open spaces, the westward push, the idea of the West as a place of opportunity, self-discovery, and financial triumph. From the pioneers to the California gold rushers. Now, Willie's father took the family westward to sell his flutes, and he, in succeeding in this and making money, actualized that myth, just as he actualized the myth, the bootstrap myth. But the fact is that it's not just the father, but also in a way that we'll see is perhaps less savory, Willie's older brother Ben, in his dealings with Alaska, also moved west in a way that Willie himself didn't, because Willie stayed put. Now, Willie's son, Biff, as we're going to see, reveals how this dream of westward migration has become bankrupt in the present day, in 1949, through, as we'll see, Biff's own abortive journeys westward and failure to discover himself or in any way succeed economically. Now, even though Willie himself has then failed to embody either the myth of American success or the westward movement, he nonetheless tries to live vicariously through his son, specifically through his older son, Biff, only to find that his son's failures to achieve happiness in their lives reinforce the emptiness of these myths in contemporary America. Both sons, both Biff and the ironically named Happy, are unhappy, miserable, unfulfilled, just as Willie himself is. Now, just as the myths that Willie has tried and failed to actualize in his life are exhausted in America, so too Willie is himself exhausted. Here's how he's described. He is past 60 years of age, dressed quietly. Even as he crosses the stage to the doorway of the house, his exhaustion is apparent. Okay. Now, unable to face the present, as I've suggested, and unable to find vicarious satisfaction for his dreams in either Biff or Happy, Willie tends more and more to retreat into the past, to seek moments in the past when he had actually believed in himself and in the possibility of some kind of triumphant self-actualization, when he had believed also in the possibility of his sons, and when he had believed, to put it simply, in the viability of the American dream. Willie's need to retreat into the past is so great that when the play opens, he has become unable to separate these compulsive journeys into memory from the present. He confuses the two as he is driving in his car and even as he is sitting in his own kitchen. In short, we recognize early on that Willie's mind is beginning to break down under the crushing force of his failure as a salesman and also his failure as a father, his inability to separate past and present as a primary manifestation of this mental disintegration. Now, Death of a Salesman is then partly a memory play in which Willie's recollections of the past frequently will intrude into the present action on stage, in which his physical location and his mental location become blurred. And to evoke the force of the past in Willie's mind, the way in which it becomes more and more dominant, the way in which, in its dominance, he loses track of the past and present as his mind disintegrates, Miller does something remarkable. He builds this sense of temporal collapse, of a kind of fluidity of past and present into the stage set itself. We're told that whenever the action is in the present, the actors observe the imaginary wall lines, entering the house only through its door to the left. But there's actually no wall there. But in the scenes of the past, these boundaries, these invisible boundaries, are broken, and the characters enter or leave a room by stepping through a wall onto the fourth stage. Now, there are then, in the stage set of this play, no actual spatial walls in the house, to reflect the fact that there are no temporal walls separating the now and then, the past and present, in Willie's consciousness. The only anchor that Willie has in his mental decline is his wife, Linda. She is his primary grip on reality, insofar as he has one, and she is his only stay against despair. Miller tells us, Linda more than loves Willie. She admires him as though his mercurial nature, his temper, his massive dreams and little cruelties served her only as sharp reminders of the turbulent longings within him. In short, Linda still believes in Willie as a great man, as a man somehow commensurate to fulfilling his own extravagant but failed dreams. And she believes in Willie then, even when Willie is unable to believe in himself. As Willie tells her, "You're my foundation, my support." It's true. Now, obviously, there is a discrepancy between Willie's massive dreams and his diminished reality. But those massive dreams of success, of being recognized as a special individual, those massive dreams are the key to Willie's sense of dignity, a key word in Miller. Because for Miller, as you'll remember from the essay, a person's attempt to preserve their sense of personal dignity, their place in the world, their struggle to do that is the essence of tragedy. When we first see Willie, as he is in the house, he is so tired that he has actually failed to go through with his sales trip in New England. He has returned home in a state of exhaustion and confusion. He's at the end of his rope physically and mentally. He is breaking down like that car that he drives, which breaks down so often. He explains to Linda, "I'm tired to death. I couldn't make it. I just couldn't make it, Linda. I suddenly couldn't drive anymore. The car kept going onto the shoulder, you know?" The fact that the car keeps going onto the shoulder may, when we look back, suggest that Willie is in some way suicidal without quite yet recognizing it. Suddenly I realize, I'm going 60 miles an hour and I don't remember the last 5 minutes. I can't seem to keep my mind on anything. I'm driving along, you understand? And I was fine. I was even observing the scenery, and it was scenery on the road every week of my life. It's so beautiful up there, Linda, in New England. The trees are so thick and the sun is warm. And then I opened the windshield and let the warm air bathe over me. And then all of a sudden, I'm going off the road again. So I went off again. And 5 minutes later, I'm dreaming again. And nearly, he presses 2 fingers to his eyes. I have such thoughts. I have such strange thoughts. Now, consider what's going on in this description. Remember that in the late 1940s, cars, like the one that Willie is driving on this aborted sales trip to New England, cars had permanent windshields. You didn't have to lower windshields. But as Willie was driving along, he lost track of the present, lost track of the car he was actually driving, and thought he was back in his old red Chevrolet, a car from the 1930s where you did sometimes have to lower the windshield. So as Willie enters old age, he finds himself drifting compulsively into the past, into the time of that red Chevrolet, in order to escape the corrosive sense of failure and disillusionment and loss of all hope in his present. Now, Willie's hope for many years had been that Biff, who is now 34, would redeem his own mediocrity by becoming the huge success that Willie imagined he would become. Instead, Biff has, for well over a decade, drifted from job to job, much to Willie's frustration and anger, and much to Willie's sense of betrayal. This is not what he expected of his older son. But if Biff is, in Willie's mind, a failure, how does Willie then define success within the context of the American dream that he has inherited but failed to live out himself? Well, this gets at Willie's fundamental problem. It gets at, we're in Aristotelian terms, at Willie's tragic mistake, his hamartia. Because consider Willie's remarks to Linda about Biff. Willie says, "Work a lifetime to pay off a house. You finally own it, and now there's nobody to live in it." Well, dear, life is a casting off. It's always that way. No, Linda. Some people accomplish something. Did Biff say anything after I went out this morning? I simply asked him if he was making any money. Is that a criticism? Note that it becomes clear right here that Willie defines success for himself and for his son as making lots of money. But also we'll see Willie defines success more specifically by making lots of money by being popular, something that in fact simply doesn't happen. In fact, Willie naively imagines that being well-liked is the key, the way to wealth, even though it manifestly is not. And he has learned nothing from his own experience in trying to be liked in order to be financially successful. Now, he is neither well-liked nor successful. Willie is baffled and disappointed that Biff, someone who was once so popular in high school, has failed to succeed by exploiting that likability into wealth. Now, part of the past, then, in which Willie seeks refuge is a time in the past when Biff was still a young man of wonderful potential, specifically Biff's high school years, when it seemed that he could do anything. Willie says, Linda tells Willie, "I think, Willie, that Biff is lost. I think he's very lost." To which Willie then replies, "Biff Loman is lost. In the greatest country in the world, a young man with such personal attractiveness gets lost. Oh, I don't remember," Willie says, "how they used to follow him around in high school. When he smiled at one of them, their faces lit up. When he walked down the street," and then Willie loses himself in reminiscences of this past, of the glory of Biff as a high school senior. That is one of the times that Willie most values. Now, when Willie complains about Biff's lack of direction and financial success, he is raging at the loss of his vicarious satisfaction for himself that he had sought through his older son. But in his anger and frustration at Biff, Willie is also raging at the image of his own failure that he sees reflected in Biff. Willie has failed Biff, both as a member of the American capitalist order, but he's also failed, we'll see, as a guiding father. And the sense of both of those failures gnaws at him, and he cannot bear it. They prey upon him in the present. When the play opens, Biff and Happy have, by apparent coincidence, both come home to pay visits. Thus, it's a kind of family reunion. Biff has returned from Texas, where he's been working as a lowly ranch hand, and Happy has simply crossed over from Manhattan, where he is in business, in part of a large company. They are both, these two brothers, discontented, and as such, they represent the failure of the two American myths that I described earlier. Biff has not found himself or opportunity in low-paying jobs, even though he has gone out west, the ostensible American direction of opportunity. And Happy finds that pulling himself up, if you will, to a high salary in business doesn't keep him from being miserable and lonely. Thus, it seems that he finds that the American dream of the bootstrap myth is bankrupt, is meaningless. Both myths are subverted when we get their first conversation between these brothers. In fact, like Willie, their first impulse as they speak to one another, both unhappy, is to try to escape their present situations by immediately revisiting the glories of their youth, of the past. Willie says, hearing Willie says, funny, Biff, you know, us sleeping here at the house again in our old beds. He pats the bed affectionately. All the talk that went across these two beds, our whole lives. Biff, yeah, a lot of dreams, a lot of plans here. To which Happy replies with a deep and masculine laugh, about 500 women would like to know what was said in this room. There was a time, yes, there was a time when Biff in particular was a real Casanova, infinitely popular. Now, the only thing that, in the course of this conversation, we realized that having watched Willie's struggles, Biff has rejected the life of money-making. He has rejected the rat race of American capitalism. He sees it as venal and disillusioning, but Biff can't shake the feeling that he is nonetheless squandering his life as he drifts, as he has for a decade, around the vast spaces of the American West. It doesn't seem to do anything for him as an alternative. He says, I'll tell you, Hap, I don't know what the future is. I don't know what I'm supposed to want. What do you mean? Well, I spent 6 or 7 years after high school trying to work myself up, shipping clerk, salesman, business of one kind or another, and its measly manner of existence, to get that subway or the hot mornings in the summer, to devote your whole life to keeping stock or making phone calls or selling or buying, to suffer 50 weeks a year for the sake of a 2-week vacation when all you really desire is to be outdoors with your shirt off, and always to have to get ahead of the next fella, and still, that's how you build a future. He doesn't want it. But on the other hand, whenever spring comes and where I am out west, I suddenly get the feeling, my God, I'm not getting anywhere. What the hell am I doing? Playing around with horses, $28 a week. I'm 34 years old. I ought to be making a future. I always made a point of not wasting my life, and every time I come back here, I know that I've done nothing but waste my life. And the very fact that he comes back indicates that he hasn't found himself. Now, Happy is no less disillusioned with his life. He has been driven to make money, something that Biff has rejected, but material gain has left Happy depressed, unfulfilled, alienated, and he is anything but popular, which Willie feels is very important. Happy says, I don't know what the hell I'm working for. Sometimes I sit in my apartment all alone, and I think of the rent I'm paying, and it's crazy, and then it's what I've always wanted, but my own apartment, a car, plenty of women, and still, God damn it, I'm lonely. Now, the only thing that keeps Happy at his job is really an expression of his bitterness for it. What keeps him there is, as he explains, his desire to subvert his bosses by sleeping with their wives and girlfriends. This is what he has gleaned from capitalism, that sense of competition as a form of injuring others. Now, although Happy doesn't understand it as such, that aggressive behavior, that subversive behavior, is really a protest against the business world and its ethos of ruthless competition. Happy exploits competition destructively precisely because he hates it. It has made him nothing but unhappy. He tells us that I got to show some of those pompous, self-important executives at work over there that Hap Lohman can make the grade. So you know what I did? Well, that girl Charlotte, I was with her tonight. She's engaged to be married in 5 weeks. No kidding. Sure, the guy's in line, her boyfriend, for a vice presidency of the store. I don't know what gets into me sometimes, Biff. Maybe I just have an overdeveloped sense of competition or something, but I went and I ruined Charlotte. And furthermore, I can't get rid of her. And he's the third executive that I've done that to. I hate myself for it because I don't want the girl, and still I take it and I love it, you know. Okay. It's a form of protest against what he is and what business has made him. Now, even though neither brother then is satisfied, Biff tries to lure Happy out west in a scheme to raise cattle. And Happy, reciprocally, tries to encourage Biff to take a business job in the city. as if somehow what hasn't worked for them might work for the other. Of course, it's hopeless. Ironically, they each urge the other to do what hasn't made them satisfied. In truth, neither knows what he wants. Now, like Willie, both sons are disillusioned and uncertain about themselves. They hear Willie's voice as they're talking in the bedroom. They hear Willie's voice from the kitchen, where he is drinking milk, and he is so lost in the past that he imagines that he is speaking to them as they are boys. He imagines somehow that he is at a time, let us say, 12 or 14 years earlier, when they were still young men living at home, perhaps even longer. Let's consider the memory at this moment as Willie sits in the kitchen that has intruded into his present and is being enacted on stage. The memory comes at a time that Willie particularly longs to recapture, but as we'll see, this memory into which he has retreated also suggests much about the cause of his unfulfilled dreams, why they are so stillborn. Willie recalls a scene from Biff's senior year in high school, where he was a football star, enormously popular, and a ladies' man. In short, he recalls a time that might be, say, 15 or 16 years specifically in the past. Biff and Happy are waxing Willie's red Chevy, and it seems, at least in the first moment of this recollection, that Willie is recapturing it because that moment embodied everything that his current life in the present has denied him. It seems to be a moment of relative prosperity, symbolized by the shiny car, and a moment of family unity, reflected in the adoration and trust of his sons, who are Simonizing it, and who are both not only eager to please Willie, but eager to learn from him. Biff taking Willie's hand. "This Saturday, Pop, this Saturday for you. I'm going to break through for a touchdown." Happy points out, "You're supposed to pass the football, Biff." "No, I'm taking one play just for Pop. You watch me, Pop. And when I take off my helmet, that means I'm breaking out. Then you watch me crash through that line." Willie kisses Biff. "Oh, wait till I tell this in Boston." Okay. Now, we understand why Willie is drawn to this moment. He's drawn to it because of the illusion of prosperity, because of the devotion of his sons. But above all, he's drawn to this moment because it was at a time when Willie still believed in his own future enough that he could claim, even fallaciously, to his sons that he was a success. It was a moment where, even though he wasn't as much of a success as he claimed, he still felt he could become one. He could live out the American dream as a well-liked salesman. Thus, when he talks to his boys, he says, "You, Hap, and I'll show you all over the towns. America's full of beautiful towns. We'll go on the road together. There are fine, upstanding people. And they all know me, boys. They know me up and down New England," he brags. Now, underlying this somewhat exaggerated confidence is a tremendous need in Willie. Biff and Happy crave his approval, but the fact is that Willie needs their adoration more than they need his approval. He needs their adoration in order to sustain this idea of himself that he is trying to evoke. In short, both the sons and the father have needs that feed off each other, but Willie's is the greater. Note, though, that as Willie's memory continues, it begins to reveal his weaknesses and failures both as a salesman and as a parent. And this begins when Bernard enters. Bernard is the son of the next door neighbor. He is a hard-working and bright young man who has agreed to tutor Biff, who is clearly an easily distracted student and football star. He comes over to get Biff because he's supposed to be tutoring him in math. Consider how this conversation goes. Bernard says, "If you don't start studying math, if Biff don't start studying math, the teacher's going to flunk you and you won't graduate." "Huh, I heard him say it." Bernard adds, "Come, Biff doesn't want to come. Okay, I'm waiting for you in the house, Biff. Bernard goes off, okay, and the Lomans all laugh. Willie, Bernard is not well liked, is he? Biff says. He's liked, but he's not well liked. Happy. That's right, Pop. To which Willie then says, that's just what I mean. Bernard can get the best marks in school, you understand. And when he gets out in the business world, you understand, you're going to be 5 times ahead of him. That's what I think. Almighty God, you're both built like Adonises. Because the man who makes an appearance in the business world, the man who creates personal interest, is the man who gets ahead. Be liked and you will never want. You take me, for instance. I never have to wait in line to see a buyer. Willie Loman's here. That's all they have to know. And I go right through. Note a little bit later, he makes these same claims. But what we find here is that Willie's shortcomings are apparent because he completely misunderstands in this description of his own success, supposedly, and the future success of his sons. He completely misunderstands the bootstrap myth. Willie does not understand that financial success comes through hard work, even though that is at the very heart of the myth and the Horatio Alger story. Willie somehow has left that out of his own particular calculus. Rather, Willie believes that success, pulling yourself up in the world, derives from popularity, from a cult of personality, from being liked. Thus, Willie mocks Bernard and dismisses Biff's need to study, which proves to be a fatal error, which contributes to the destruction, essentially, of Biff's life. As a result of Willie's bad example, the dismissal of the idea of work and discipline as necessary for success, as a result of that, Biff never learns discipline and never learns how to work productively. He can only work in short spurts. He can't work under authority. He lacks any sense of determination and any sense of perseverance. Now, where did Willie get this misguided idea that success comes through being liked? Well, the fact is that Willie didn't have anyone to teach him. He had no father figure who he ever remembers to instruct him. Indeed, Willie hardly remembers this mythological father. He has only the description of him and his successes that come to Willie from his much older brother Ben, who did remember their father. Ben presents the father as someone who has fulfilled both the bootstrap and Western myths. But of course, Willie can't remember this from his early childhood before the father disappeared. And as a result, Willie has no role model himself. And this fills Willie with insecurity in what he expresses in one of the play's most important lines. He says to Ben in a flashback, because Ben, I have a fine position here, but Dad left when I was such a baby, and I never had a chance to talk to him. And so I still feel kind of temporary about myself. Temporary about myself. It's a key phrase. Willie feels temporary about himself because for all of his bravado before his sons, he lacks any clear idea of who he is or what it takes to fulfill his dreams with any real understanding. In the absence of self-knowledge and the absence of any awareness of the importance of sustained hard work, Willie not only fails as a salesman often, increasingly, but he also sets a poor example for his sons. Even at a time when they are revering him as adolescents, he's inculcating the wrong idea about how to get ahead. Now, the memory that I've been describing with the Simonizing of the car reveals another failure on Willie's part toward Biff and Happy. And this one is not simply a failure of misguided advice and a poor example that Willie is representing to them. It is a more explicitly moral failure. Willie excuses and even encourages Biff's stealing and his rather reckless behavior. Biff has pilfered a football from the high school locker room when he's not supposed to. Biff drives without a license. And in another memory, Willie even brags to his brother Ben, who is visiting in this memory, about the lumber that, under his encouragement, his sons have stolen from a building site. He says, you should have seen the lumber they brought home last week, Ben. At least a dozen 6x10s worth all kinds of money. Now, Willie assumes that crimes of this kind will naturally be forgiven or overlooked if someone, like his son, particularly Biff, is charming and popular. And so he brags about this to the visiting Ben. But unfortunately, when Biff is accused of theft, we know that Willie disavows all responsibility, even though he is often, to a large degree, responsible. He says, what's he's stealing? He's giving it back, isn't he? Why is he stealing? What did I tell him? I never in my life told him anything but decent things. Well, Willie's lie to himself here is significant. And the very fact that he has to lie to himself about this influence he's had, which has led to Biff's stealing, is a sign of the guilt he feels but refuses to own. Indeed, one of Willie's greatest weaknesses is his tendency not just to lie to others about his successes, but to lie to himself about his own capacities and about his own failures in a self-protective way. Now, in the memory sequence, there is yet another parental failure revealed, I think, in this extended scene. And that is Willie's clear and prejudicial preference for Biff over Happy. It's not that he doesn't like Happy, it's that he adores Biff. And indeed, he relies on both sons' adoration of him, but despite the need to be adored by both sons, Willie has invested the vast majority of his hopes in his older son, the football star. Now, Happy tries and fails throughout the memory sequence to get his father's attention. He says, look at me, Dad, I'm losing weight, and he does various calisthenics to try to get attention, but he feels ignored. He feels, not surprisingly, that he's a kind of accessory to Biff, and this later causes unmistakable resentment. Even though Happy has achieved the kind of strictly financial success that Willie dreamed of for himself, and that for Willie is part and parcel of the American dream, and even though Willie has dreamed of it for his sons, the fact is that Happy is bitter, and it's also true that Happy's wealth isn't enough for Willie because Happy doesn't exude the popularity that Willie fetishizes, and Willie realizes that the money he has made is not because he is well-liked, quite the opposite. Yet, the fact is that despite this antagonism, Happy resembles his father in one unfortunate way, as we'll see. In his loneliness, Happy has adopted Willie's habit of relying on women to relieve his solitude and boost his ego. It's not just that he sleeps with the wives and girlfriends of his bosses to subvert them because he hates the business he's in. It's also because he is so personally unhappy that it is a kind of diversion. Now, note that Willie has concentrated then his hopes on Biff. And despite repeated disappointments, even in the present, and despite his anger and sense of betrayal, Willie still does. Consider this remark that he makes to his next-door neighbor, Charlie. After Willie has spoken with Biff, he tells Charlie, as they play cards, Biff's going back to Texas again. What the hell is that? Charlie says, let him go, Willie. Willie, I've got nothing to give him, Charlie. I'm clean. Charlie, he won't starve. None of them starve. Forget about Biff. Forget about him. To which Willie then says, then what have I got to remember? Charlie then says, you take it too hard. To hell with it. When a deposit bottle is broken, you don't get your nickel back. Willie replies, that's easy enough for you to say. Now, let's consider this. Willie suggests that it's easy for Charlie to say, oh, just give up on Biff. There's no hope. He's a broken bottle. He's broken. And it's easy enough, Willie says, for Charlie to make that remark because Charlie's own son, Bernard, is a lawyer. He's a great success, as we'll see. But Willie will not relinquish hope in Biff. As he says, it's easy for you to say, but if I don't have him, what have I got to remember? He won't relinquish hope, won't give up on the promise of Biff's past, because that past, when he believed in Biff, at that time when Biff was in high school, is really all that Willie has to remember and to cherish in the past. and he wants somehow to believe in that still now and then as a possibility in the future. Thus he tries to renew that belief in Biff, as he has done often before, even in the present time in the play. Hopelessly, though, and ultimately catastrophically. Now, I've noted that Willie retreats into the past as an escape from the unbearable pressures and disillusionment of the present. But at times, I think we're going to see increasingly, the past is not such a happy refuge. Indeed, Willie's sense of personal failure is all the more painful because at moments in the past, increasingly, he finds that he is summoning up, quite against any conscious intention, moments of pain, moments of trauma, moments of missed opportunity. And one of those comes when he recalls his decision not to go to Alaska at his brother Ben's invitation for a great ore strike, for the possibility of some tremendous economic gain. Now, this comes in Willie's memory when Ben's visit. And this memory seems to date from a time not long after the car polishing scene, certainly within the same several months or year. Okay? Now, Willie views his older brother Ben as he views his father, as a successful embodiment of both the American bootstrap myth of rising to success financially and also the myth of triumph and self-discovery and fabulous accumulation in the westward movement. But the fact is that while Willie invests that belief in his brother, as he does in his father, unlike the father, Ben is not a successful embodiment. Rather, Ben is what we might call a perversion of both the bootstrap and Western myths that their father had more successfully embodied. Before going to Alaska, we learn, Ben actually had first gone to Africa, the opposite direction, east, not west, and in Africa he exploited the natives to mine diamonds, and he brags about this in the scene that Willie recalls. Willie says, hanging on to his words, oh, that's good to hear, but sometimes, I'm afraid, Ben, I'm not teaching my sons the right kind of, how should I teach them? Ben, giving great weight to each word and with a certain vicious audacity, says, William, when I walked into the jungle in Africa, I was 17. When I walked out, I was 21, and by God, I was rich. We learn that he's rich, of course, through this rape of the land and exploitation of the natives. But note that during this entire visit, Ben preaches the law that he has lived by as a would-be businessman. The law of the jungle, essentially. I went into the jungle and I came out. Ben has no moral scruples. And certainly then, he is no one to advise Willie, even though Willie asks him, on how he should teach his sons. The law of the jungle is not what he should be teaching. Willie may have misconceptions about how you get ahead, but Ben's is perhaps worse. Ben preaches profit at any cost. And this is the lesson that, in fact, Ben tries to impart to Biff during this remembered visit in this curious scene. Biff, with his fine physique, is playing around and takes a boxing stance. Come on, get me, he laughs. Willie says, go on, Biff, go on, show him what a boxer you are. Biff says, okay. He cocks his fist. Ben at that point says, good boy. And suddenly he comes in, trips Biff, and stands over him, the point of his umbrella poised over Biff's eye. Look out, Biff. Gee. Ben, patting Biff's knee, says, never fight fair with a stranger, boy. You'll never get out of the jungle that way. Taking Linda's hand and bowing. It's an honor. Now, ironically, Biff, who is subjected to this lesson, Biff rejects the wisdom or the lesson in subverting your neighbor, in fighting by any means, of, as he puts it, never fighting fair. He rejects that. But, Happy, on the other hand, seems to have adopted it, even though that hyper-competition and subversion of his bosses and other colleagues has only made him more miserable. Now, obviously, Ben's advice to get ahead by doing in others conflicts with Willie's gospel of getting ahead by being well-liked. They're both completely misguided. They're both immoral in a certain sense, but Ben's is the more pernicious because Ben really does get ahead through his savagery and amorality, whereas Willie fails in his attempt to get ahead by being popular. Even in his flashbacks, Willie realizes that his efforts to advance by being liked have failed, and they fail indeed increasingly. So that even 15 years earlier, he was lying to his sons when he bragged about how welcomed he was all over New England. But Willie at that time needed to sustain Biff and Happy's belief in order to sustain some faltering belief in himself. He hides his failures from them, and in lying to them uses their adulation to try to convince himself that the version of himself that he's presented to them is true. Now, this loss of faith in Willie, this sense of a failure as a businessman, is all the more devastating in the present for the 62-year-old Willie. But the fact is that we find out, even in the flashback, that he had doubts about himself and his potential to become a successful businessman, salesman, even at that time of his happiest memory, when the Simonizing of the car. He recalls confessing during this period to Linda, years earlier, his own concerns about his career trajectory. He says, you know, the trouble on that last sales trip was the 3 of the stores were half closed for inventory in Boston. Otherwise, I could have broke records, Linda. I could have broke records, but, you know, that goddamn Chevrolet I was driving, they ought to prohibit the manufacture of that car. Oh, $120 to fix it. My God, if it doesn't pick up, I don't know what I'm going to do, Linda. And then he says, oh, you know, the trouble is, Linda, people don't seem to take to me. I know when I walk in, they seem to laugh at me, you know, or else they just pass me by. I'm not noticed. And then Willie says, you know, I'm fat. I'm very foolish to look at, Linda. And remember, he's still a fairly young man here. Foolish to look at, Linda. I didn't tell you, but Christmas time, I happened to be calling at F.H. Stewart's, and a salesman I know as I was going to see the buyer, I heard him say something about walrus, and I cracked him right across the face. I won't take that. I simply will not take that. But they do laugh at me. I know that, but I won't take it. Okay. I will not take that. It's Willie's protest, one that for Arthur Miller makes him tragic. Willie asserts or tries to assert his dignity against a world that would rob him of it, that would mock him and diminish him. This is an articulation of the fundamental essence of his tragedy. Now, even if we recognize Willie's mistakes, which are numerous, and his bad example, and his lies, and his self-delusion, even if we recognize all that, as Miller makes us, we must still respect this attempt to assert his dignity. But in doing so, Miller would suggest, we are not to pity Willie here, but rather to fear that we could somehow be in his situation. Well, if Willie's lies to his son, as we've seen, he also sometimes lies to Linda, who is on other occasions the only one to whom he will speak the truth about his own insecurities. There's a specific lie, because immediately after the memory of confessing his failures and insecurities as a salesman to Linda, Willie then moves to another memory, a memory of the woman whom he slept with on the road, and a woman whom Biff discovers he has been sleeping with later in a moment of crushing disillusionment. We're told that there is laughter heard, and the woman has come on just after the conversation with Linda from behind the scrim and is standing, putting on her hat, looking into the mirror and laughing. Willie says, because I get so lonely, especially when business is bad and there's nobody to talk to. The woman says, "Oh, Willie, I picked you." "You picked me?" "Yes, I think you're a wonderful man. You picked me, eh?" Now, what Willie seeks in this woman, it becomes pretty clear, isn't so much sex as support for his faltering ego when Linda is absent, the one who normally supports it. When he says, "You picked me," it's clear that she makes him feel special, the way he wants to see himself. That flattery helps Willie cope with his failures on the road. It artificially inflates his ego, much in the same way that his sons lavish their praise on him, even as he milks it in order to inflate his ego. But all of this is relative, because even in that past with his sons, while he had a certain insecurity and knew that he was not succeeding as he claimed he was, there was still a sense of hope. When he's on the road alone, that sense of hope is much harder to sustain. The problem is that there is no real sense of self in Willie, underlying the artificial pumped-up self-conception that he uses this woman and his sons at this point in his life to sustain. So we realize that self-knowledge of the kind that is so crucial in Shakespearean tragedy, the importance of a Hamlet or Lear or Othello, recognizing how and why they have erred, and in some way in that moment achieving a kind of nobility through the agony of self-recognition, that self-knowledge isn't something that is a requirement for Arthur Miller, and we're not really going to find it in Willie Loman. In fact, part of Willie's tragedy is that he never really does or can know who he is. Nonetheless, he wants his dignity, he wants respect, he wants what Miller would call a place in the world, and that alone is sufficient to generate tragedy in Miller's view. Self-awareness, self-knowledge, a kind of breakthrough, does not. Willie is mocked in the present, even more than he was mocked in the past. He's regarded as a relic or simply ignored, diminished. Now, Linda, having heard this from Willie and understanding how deeply it pains him, Willie reveals to Biff and Happy that Willie's company has taken away his salary after 36 years with them, and that his current boss, the son of the boss he started with, is now forcing Willie to work entirely on the slim sales commissions that he earns. His area of sales has also been diminished. Now, I've noted that although Willie's memories are meant to be a consoling escape from his present, they sometimes, I observed, force him inadvertently, uncontrollably, associatively, as they descend upon him, to relive the deepest traumas of his life. In short, as these unpleasant memories become more and more frequent, we see that Willie is losing his ability to control those memories. It's not that he is retreating into them by any desire, it's that they now simply are upwelling in ways that he can't govern. Now, we saw this, for example, in the midst of the card game in the present with Charlie, when he relived the troubling encounter with his older brother, Ben. Ben reminded Willie of his failures as a wage earner. Ben says, "Our father made more in a week than a man like you could in a lifetime." Oh! Remember that Willie associates success with wealth. Well, Ben, who in a scene I earlier talked about, then stands over Biff with his umbrella poised over Biff's eye. Ben is clearly, as that gesture with the umbrella would suggest, and all of its phallic penetrating power over a subordinate younger man, Ben is a castrating force, a kind of phallic source of manly energy, who makes both Willie and Biff feel humiliated, makes them feel unmanned. And this is one reason why, in a kind of curious and codependent way, Biff and Willie are both damaged men who question their own masculinity and their capacity for any sense of success in the idiom of American money-making and stability. The fact is, though, that because they are both so damaged, they need one another all the more. Even as Willie rails against Biff as a drifter who has failed to live up to Willie's dreams for him, who has failed to live up to Willie's idea of his potential, even as he rails against Biff, Willie still desperately invests hope for the future in Biff. Now, since memory has become increasingly troubling, Willie's only alternative then to the unbearable present is an imaginary future. And Linda explains toward the end of Act 1 this need for the hope of the future in her husband to Biff. Linda says, he likes to have a letter, you know, just to know there's still a possibility for better things for you, if only you'd write to him. And then Linda says, when you write you're coming, Willie's all smiles and talks about the future, and he's just wonderful. And then the closer you seem to come, the more shaky he gets. And then by the time you get here, he's arguing. He seems angry at you. Biff says, I just can't seem to take hold, Mom. I can't take hold of some kind of life, knowing that that disappoints his father. Now, as Linda describes it, distance nourishes Willie's hope. He can hope as long as he doesn't actually have to see his son back home. But when Biff does come back home, he finds, of course, that he sees he hasn't done anything and he's frustrated and angry. But nonetheless, on some of these visits, Willie, still in his desperation, summons up visions of a vicarious triumph through this older, seemingly ne'er-do-well son. There's always some self-delusive capacity here. So, a moment after Willie, on this particular visit, a moment after Willie tells Biff, you never grew up, what does he do? A moment later, he seizes on Biff's rather casual announcement that he plans to see Bob Harrison about fronting him for a sporting goods business. And suddenly, Willie pivots back to extravagant hopes. Willie says, there's 50 men in the city of New York who'd stake him, who would stake Biff to Biff. Sporting goods, huh? Yeah, I guess so. I know something about it. Well, you know something about it. You know sporting goods better than Spalding, for God's sake. How much is he giving you? This is a $1 million idea, Biff. Okay. Now, when Happy then builds on this rare moment of Willie's enthusiasm and suggests that maybe he and Biff can work together, and maybe even with Willie, to create a Loman line of sporting goods and link it with various professional sports teams, when Willie hears this, he is thrilled because this vision of a imagined future connects with Willie's happiest memories of the family past, connects with those moments in the past that we've seen when his sons believed in him, even when he was lying or exaggerating his financial success. Willie takes pleasure in this connection of this imaginary future with a revered past. It'd be family again then, Happy says. There'd be an old honor and comradeship. And if they wanted to get off or swim or something, well, we could do it. To Willie says, okay, yeah, that's it. That's it. Yes, lick the world, lick the world. We can lick the world. Now, like Linda, Happy knows that Willie needs not just family support in this fantasy, but that he's seeking a sense of dignity. And that dignity rests upon his belief in the future of Biff, no matter how improbable it might seem. As Linda tells Biff then, Biff, Willie's life is in your hands. She explains to him that Willie is not only losing his mind, but he is becoming, in his despair, suicidal. The car wreck on the bridge, she says, wasn't an accident. And we remember Willie's descriptions of driving off the road and wondering what he was doing. And indeed, we also note, she says, that Willie has hidden a little rubber pipe to attach to a car's tailpipe so that he can gas himself to death. Now, even though Willie calls the sporting goods scheme a $1 million idea, he's obviously deceiving himself in that both he and Happy know very well that Biff, whatever his other talents might be, is completely unsuited for business. He's not only rejected business, as we know, but he seems to be completely without a capacity for it. He's unsuited in it because he has no interest in making money, but also because he has absorbed and lived by Willie's misguided advice. That is to say, in trying to advance himself in the past, he has done so by trying to be lighthearted and popular, and he has failed for that very reason. Biff says, "It's just that I don't fit in business," and he's absolutely right. Now, note that Happy understands this, and Happy understands exactly why Biff has failed in his attempts to advance and why he is so ill-suited for business. The hyper-competitive Happy has never made a pretext of being liked in business, whereas Biff has. And Happy knows that Biff has failed because he has sadly followed Willie's advice of trying to please people in unserious ways, when in fact business is very serious. Thus he reminds his brother Biff of the mistakes he's made in the past. He says that Bob Harrison, you remember he worked for Bob Harrison? Bob Harrison said, "You were the tops, and then you go and do some damn fool thing like whistling whole songs in the elevator." Biff against Happy, "So what? I like to whistle." Happy says, "You don't raise a guy to a responsible job who whistles in the elevator. Come on." Now, this same misguided approach to trying lightheartedly to please people and be popular has caused Willie's own failure as a salesman. Willie, on the road, would rather schmooze than sell. And Willie hasn't learned from his own personal mistakes, and as a result, he has not adapted at all to a changing, faster-paced, market-driven American economy. Willie still tries to get by joking and backslapping in an attempt to be liked that never really worked to begin with, and now more and more causes him to be regarded as a kind of pariah and a fool. He's mocked, and this is the source of pain for Biff, who knows now that Willie was laughed at even when they revered him, even when they thought he was a great man. Biff says, I know now. They laughed at Dad for years, and you know why? Because we don't belong in this nut house of a city. We should be mixing cement on some open plain, or carpenters. A carpenter was allowed to whistle. Yeah, that would suit his temperament more. Now, just as Willie feels betrayed by Biff's failures to succeed or to find himself, Biff feels betrayed that the man he and Happy thought was their father, a man they thought was celebrated all over New England, the man they adored, wasn't real, that it was a lie. And they know now that even back then he was a laughable fraud. The sense of betrayal that they feel, particularly Biff, is acute. Biff says, I know he's a fake, and he doesn't like anybody around who knows it. Anybody who points out what the fake he was, he can't bear. That's why he gets angry at me. Now, Happy has been able to live with this awareness of Willie's fraudulence in a way that Biff has not, without such a deep sense of betrayal, because the fact is that Happy never invested nearly as much faith in Willie as a guide as Biff did, and instead, in part, because Happy felt rather ignored by his father. Indeed, we realize that even his mother, Linda, tends to ignore Happy, as, for example, when he says he's getting married and nobody pays any attention to it. But unlike Happy, Biff did invest massive faith in Willie as a great man, as a guide, just as Willie invested all his dreams in Biff. The reason that Biff and Willie constantly argue then, when Biff returns home from the West, is that each sees in the other not just a source of betrayal, but a painful image of his own failed self. Each sees in the other his own ruined dreams and his own failure to change in order to succeed. Neither Willie nor Biff, then, have advanced because, in a sense, they're both paralyzed. Neither of them have really grown up. And indeed, they see, much to their discontent, their own paralysis mirrored in one another. Consider Willie's advice to Biff concerning his planned business meeting, with Harrison. At first, it sounds for a moment as if Willie has actually learned something from his own misguided attempt to succeed by charming people. But then, almost compulsively, Willie harkens back to his old failed advice. Make yourself charming and lie if you have to. He begins this way as he celebrates this $1 million idea. He says, Biff, walk in very seriously into the office. You're not applying for a boy's job. Money is to pass. Be quiet and firm and serious. Everybody likes a kidder, but nobody lends him money. This is what he should have been preaching to his sons years before. But then what happens? As he continues in this fit of visionary enthusiasm, he then says, yeah, when you get in there, start off with your good stories to lighten things up. It's not what you say, it's how you say it, because personality always wins the day. Oh dear, he's back to where he started from. And a little bit later, he emphasizes this even more. Tell him you were in business in the West. Don't tell him you were doing farm work. Tell him you were in business out there. In short, exaggerate. Lie to him. So the two pieces of information he has given Biff now are the same that he gave him 15 years earlier. Get ahead by being popular and bullshit with him to charm him, and you can be dishonest. It's okay to be dishonest. Both of which have already shown to be failures. Now, why does Willie change direction here after offering for once a piece of sound, mature advice and revert back to the claims that he made years before? Well, it's not so much, I think, that Willie really believes in what he's saying as that he wants to legitimize himself as a father, past and present, by doing so, to reclaim his dignity within the family by reinforcing the advice he gave to Biff in his youth as if it were true, as if there was some legitimacy in it, even though he knows there isn't. Now, in doing so, of course, Willie's ignoring the fact that this advice has failed them both. Feeling his own dignity assaulted, though, not just by his failing job, but also in his home, he wants to gain a sense of self-respect by pretending that Biff is still, at this moment, the malleable great hope that he was grooming as a high school senior, and that therefore the advice he gave him then will still appertain. Yes, you know what? You've got greatness in you, Biff. Remember, you've got all kinds of greatness. This particular kind of pep talk. Willie says, oh, you're like a young god, a Hercules, something like that. And the sun all around you in the past. Remember how he waved to me on that football field? A star like that, magnificent, can never really fail away. He's the same guy now. All of this attempt to reclaim the past and project it into the future. All of it diluted. Now, for his part, Biff knows that neither he nor Willie will ever succeed in business, even though he is making this misguided attempt. But he nonetheless offers his father this vicarious hope by going to a business meeting at Linda's urging. And he does so to save his father's life. As she has suggested, this is the only thing that will. Biff understands something else, though. He understands that the only time he and Willie ever found any satisfaction in work was when they were using their hands, when they were waxing the car together, or building a concrete stoop, or making things. It's something that strikes him as remarkable. We don't belong in the nut house city. We should be mixing cement in an open plain or be carpenters. Yes. Now, this begs the question, why has Willie rejected working with his hands, manual labor, which he's good at? He brags about fixing things, building things to Charlie. He enjoys doing it. He's not a good salesman and never has been. Why not then embrace what seems somehow more intrinsic to him and might actually lead to some fuller comprehension of who he is? Well, it's because the American dream, as Willie understands it, implies, as we've seen, making money and upward mobility. It implies, for him, a kind of exceptionalism that comes from getting ahead in that regard, which is essential to Willie's sense of dignity. We might find dignity in the idea of Willie as a stonemason, but Willie finds no dignity in that himself. That's not a sufficient measure of the self-respect he needs. So we realize that while Willie is certainly Miller's common man, he refuses to be an ordinary man. He fears what he regards as a kind of working class mediocrity. Now, Linda is the only one who understands the existential importance of Willie's fragile dream of self-worth in his own life and in his hopes for Biff. And despite Willie's sometimes cruel and cavalier treatment of her, Willie knows that Linda is really the only one who has genuine faith in him, or that recognizes his inner struggle and, in a certain sense, the inner stature that comes with that struggle to assert one's dignity. Linda explains it, as she understands it clearly, in the play's most famous lines, which unmistakably echo Arthur Miller's definition of the common man as tragic hero. Here's what she says to Biff. I don't say he's a great man, Willie Loman. Willie's never made a lot of money. His name was never in the paper. He's not the finest character that ever lived. But he's a human being, Biff, and a terrible thing is happening to him. So attention must be paid. He's not to be allowed to fall into the grave like an old dog. Attention, attention must finally be paid. Paid to such a person. She later adds, a small man can be just as exhausted as a great man. He works for a company 36 years this March, opens up unheard of territories to their trademark, and now in his old age they take away his salary. For 5 weeks he's been on straight commission like a beginner, an unknown. Linda does not idealize this man that she loves, but her chief concern is Willie's own, his basic human dignity, as he defines it. Attention must be paid to that dignity. In, one might say, a rare, justified use of the passive voice. Attention must be paid. Respect must be shown by the world, yes, that is turned away from him, by the company, yes, that has diminished Willie's self-worth, and above all, by Willie's sons, who seem in some way to be alienated from him. The world, the company, the sons, they must in some way, as she says, pay attention to him. It must be paid. They must be aware of what he needs. Now, as Act 1 closes, and Linda laments the way in which Willie has been isolated, been deprived of his self-worth, and made to feel useless by the company he works for, and to some extent by his own sons. As Act 1 closes, the family nonetheless goes to bed with two great expectations that build on one another. Both, of course, prove to be impossible. The first is the hopes that rest on Biff's meeting with Harrison. And the second is, inspired in part by that, the hopes that rest on Willie's meeting with his boss, Howard, in Manhattan. At Linda's urging, Willie has planned to ask Howard if he can give up the arduous life of going on the road in New England, and for a man his age who's been with the company 36 years, spend his final years with the company working closer to home in New York. Both meetings are to take place the next day, after which there is to be a meeting of Biff and Happy and Willie in a spirit of triumph. Well, as we'll see what happens next time when I analyze Act 2, none of these plans, none of these dreams reach fruition. For next time, make sure you have read Act 2 of Death of a Salesman, and I will send you that lecture, I hope, either over the weekend or on Monday. Okay? Please communicate with me. Tell me if you have any questions, any comments, and remember, your midterm exams are due on Monday. Okay? Be well.